Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Aris. Welcome. Well, I know that before the role you assumed now, you were for over a decade director with the Business Transformation Center of Cambridge University, the Institute for Sustainable Leadership, correct? So I imagine that in that decade you had the opportunity to work with big organizations, world leaders on sustainability and on digital transformation. All these things we have seen and heard being discussed around sustainable development and climate change and system change was a dominant part of this transformation. I should like to start with the basics. Let's take one at a time. If we take a look at sustainability overall, at least from the Greek market, many a time what we talk about is sustainable development as though it were one thing. We're talking about sustainability, RG and everything. It's as though we're talking about the same thing, whereas it's not, is it? Now, based on your experience all these years, what is this system element contained in sustainable development? Thank you, Kiara. Talking about sustainability, we're now talking about everything. It is a very big system, and like all systems, it is governed by relationships. Talking about systems, we refer to causality, feedback loops, unintended consequences. It is inevitable to talk about everything: financial, social, environmental, technological, all the trends that are out there. Now, think, when we want to talk about climate for a system, a big system, a large system, we have large systems, medium systems, smaller systems. When we start from the socio-economic system that we have at the moment, which is slightly in collapse and overshoot at the moment, we're talking about human development, technological development, all these things that we have advanced over the past few years. Financial development, urbanization, all these things affect one another, and in turn they all create change in the line change. Land change, loss of land, deforestation, it creates biochemical change, CO2, nitrogen, climate change, which is the result of all these things. Water stresses, loss of biodiversity that was mentioned by the previous panel. And then we go back to the beginning in square one, and everything has an impact on quality of life and health and everything. So in essence, system thinking is a way of thinking. And if we start with a more narrow viewpoint or way of thinking, it's like we look at the tree and we can't see the forest. So it's a series of issues. Sustainability it's a series of socioeconomic and financial issues that they're not only numerous, they're interconnected, aren't they? Yes, precisely. I think you gave a beautiful example about vultures, wasn't it? Well, before that, at the high level, we now know that in order to resolve the climate problem, we need to invest in nature. It is unlikely when we're thinking about Code 3, which is the COs, to reach net zero without making a huge investment in the protection and restoration of nature. It's something we can see clearly. In order to have protection and restoration of nature and climate, we need to invest in social cohesion. So at a very high level, these things are something that maybe we didn't know in the past, and development and the social dynamics 10 years ago, but now they're very well known. The vultures in India example, well, a local government in India decided to channel antibiotics, to provide antibiotics rather, in a cow population to protect their health and the health of populations. What they didn't know is that these antibiotics had a very detrimental effect on the vultures that eat the carcasses of the dead cows. So they had adverse effects on their stomachs. So after a short while, this vulture population collapsed. This had as a result in the animal carcasses remained there, filled with disease, the dogs leaving the cities to eat them, go back to the cities, bite the population, and these cities to be rampant with rabies, and in essence to deteriorate the positive health feedback that they had. At the same time, vultures, to give this as a data fact, as a tidbit, by eating those carcasses, because the carcasses decay and they emit CO2, they absorb the equivalent of 2.6 million cars on the streets every year. Had they known, surely they would have done it, which is why we say that it is best to deal with the system as a whole, to understand the unintended consequences and the relationships to be able to make proper decisions. So in essence, everything is interconnected, so you're trying to do something positive and have a positive impact without calculating that you can have a problem in another impact area of sustainability, correct? It's something we can see in businesses. That the silos that exist within companies, when they want to deal with the sustainability issue, like for climate or decarbonization strategy, it's much more different to see that in a siloed approach, I mean, just supply safe to deal with it, rather than to see it across. And this appears to make things difficult. Who looks into what, and who looks into everything as a whole, and how is all this coordinated so that climate and the company's reaction in its management be a systemic one, and at the same time not to make things just about climate, but to allow the system to have biodiversity, social impact and everything bound around this. So from your experience in this transformation, which is the model that works better, both within the companies to be able to deal with it in a more systemic way, and as to the impact area that they're trying in essence to address? Most companies, at least as of late, have reductionist approach. This is net zero, this is climate, this is whatever. And usually, this is the remit of a rather narrow sustainability team. Over the past few years, primarily after pressure from the financial market and the need of the new business models, and all this pressure that exists from the system and the economy as a whole, we had the involvement of other units, and a lot of people have been hired by the companies more specialized. In our company, Croda International, biodiversity is not handled by the sustainability team. They are the MD of the crop and seed, for instance, that have the entire access, supply chains, markets, relationships. Those are the people that have the best visibility. The decarbonization strategy that we have is handled by the head of global operations. All these are ExCo. They have nothing prior to do with sustainability. But it is in the understanding and the mindset of the company that in order to be able to react, not just from the sustainability part, but also to make it reconcile sustainability and profitability commercially, we need to have the involvement of the value creation mechanism of the company. Most companies are headed that way, rather quite a large number, but we still have a long way to go. It takes a lot of capabilities development and education. I remember when I was at Cambridge, especially in the last years, many financial institutions, banks, etc., sent hundreds of their staff for training on a systemic approach. What's happening around the world, what are the implications for us, and so on. So what can be done about it? And this carries on now with online learning. It has improved even further. But this reductionist approach that has been adopted for all these years, which is a derivative of those 50 years of neoclassical thinking and value creation that is outdated, it's slightly difficult. We can break the culture and the strategy and the governance with targeted interventions, but it takes strong will and leadership. I should like to take the example with the financial institutions and the banks. Now, given that some branches and sectors like banks, the biggest impact they have in sustainable development is indirect. It is, for instance, through their funding, 90% or maybe more, in some areas like climate. So would you say that a key distinction between this systemic approach and the other is the understanding of the direct and indirect impact of this system? How can you focus on an impact area that is related to others, and what is your role, and what is the most important one? Well, it's a really good point. So it's a couple of things. First of all, we should say that in order to intervene and to interfere with the system, no matter how big it is, you don't need to do this only with big goals. I mean, we can have small targeted intervention if we plan and design properly very beneficial benefits. If you remember, 10 or 15 years ago, Walmart started this corporate sustainability movement simply by making a supplier questionnaire. But it was their role so big and so influential that it had a catalytic effect. So they had many suppliers? Yes, exactly. Globally, they had a tremendous influence. At the moment, most companies have a narrow role, although this is beginning to change. They build coalitions, they join initiatives. It was mentioned in the previous discussions about policy. I mean, policy does not happen on its own. A government will not say that we will now regulate and achieve net zero. What you need is the test narrowed by the businesses. Like we had the change in England in 2007, 2008. You need a push, the positive push by the companies and from the companies. I believe that in order to set a long-term goal, we need to think about impact. And the challenge with this is that when we're talking about systemic impacts, it means that we don't care for our company to be profitable in the next 30 years. We're interested in living in a system that is sustainable. We need to take system type indicators and metrics, and this is slightly tricky because it means that we share success with others. And all the metrics and the indicators we have to measure success and everything with companies is much more intricate. With the work we did at the university, we slowly found that this is changing, or that it can change. But it takes fundamental changes and a huge recognition of the business in society role. So you would say that businesses of the same role have more shared value creation potential through collaborations or through an ecosystem that focuses on the same impact area and have a similar systemic approach? Well, we can't take competitiveness out of the company. That would be a mistake. But at the system level, systemic level, especially in long game, most benefits come through collaboration. We have a lot of examples from companies from the same sector or companies from different sectors. Come to think of the SDGs, whether you like it or not, in order to make a positive intervention in a country regarding health, we can't go build 5 hospitals. We need to take into account food, we need to take into account education, we need to take into account technology and innovation, and many of those initiatives that have been created are multi-sectoral. We need to involvement finance and policy in order to see things in a more systemic way. But we can have companies from the same sector. It's slightly more difficult at a systemic level sector like those financial services sector that can move forward in a relatively short while. I believe what is important here to say is that we have a circular model. So what I can see, at least in the Greek market, and like your experience from abroad, when we talk about circular economy, we're discussing it as though it were something like at the same level as climate, biodiversity and everything. These are challenges, global challenges. Cyclic economy is a way of management, a model of management that touches on all these challenges, be that energy, climate, raw material planning, management, waste management, how we will keep these materials remain in the economy for longer. So would it be the key to see circular economy as a model rather than an issue that is categorized at the same level as all the other issues? I mean, to find it as a solution that answers everything. This is a very good suggestion. usually we can see climate change and biodiversity and circular economy appear in such projects differently, but circular economy is a way to react. It deals with some very important issues. Consumption and growth are the biggest problems we have, whether we like it or not, and this is why it's difficult. We delayed very much to take action. Overconsumption and unsustainable growth is what has led us, more or less, well, along with other things so far, that's driven us so far. Circular economy tries to deal with these slightly. It is important what energy drives circular economy. It's the first principle, isn't it? Yes, it needs to be a Greek circular economy. But you can imagine that, for instance, a linear model that has 4 stages, in essence, is to implement circular economy has a parallel level of complexity with system change. Every relationship has another 5 relationships behind it. This does not mean, well, we constantly, every day, we think at the level of systems as to how long it will take us to take something somewhere, what we'll do with our children, or whatever. We find it difficult when we enter into a business mindset to leave this wider way of thinking behind, a wider way of management behind, and to allow it to move a bit further. And circular economy may be a way, this circular thinking that was adopted by earlier generations to put things back in business and everything. To introduce a systemic element? Yes. Now, well, I would like to ask you a provocative question. We have a lot of materiality here in Greece. I mean, for those who are not familiar with the word, materiality in the sense of analysis, of all these interactions, that a company wants to prioritize things to see how they will set up their strategy and so on and so forth. Now, at the level that at least we here today agree that the way that we deal with the challenges of sustainable development needs to be systemic, what is the value of materiality? Well, I have 2 hats to put on, so I will put on the Cambridge hat at the moment. Now, I have worked for approximately 20 years, and I was in a think tank that actually started materiality in a way. Materiality was never intended as a long-term tool. It was something that we built, or it was built for companies to allow, at that time in 2005, 2007, to realize that these trends are financially, economically, social material. But it remains, unfortunately, in my opinion. I don't think that we need any materiality exercise for a company to understand that climate change at any sector, any size, affects the company with physical risks, with transitional risks, and it has a tremendous role to play. Double materiality comes to help this situation a bit, but then again, it's just a snapshot, it's static. What we need to make it happen and to make it properly and to have a proper involvement in the productive parts of the company is an exercise with a long-term element. Another 2 things might help us do things better. What about the tank horizon of materiality? Is it something very important? And the majority in Greece, I think, does not take that into consideration. If we have materiality, we have a short, long strategy with net zero and everything. When we do materiality, we look at it ex post facto. It has no forward-looking, it has no specific horizon of what is more material and what is not. And possibly focusing on the impact rather than the output in materiality. I mean, if it were an impact-based materiality that would be time-bound and took into consideration and compared apples with apples and rather than apples to oranges, and then we had risk management. I mean, risk management, the way of management, it's not an impact area that we need to address. It is one of the tools to address it. So a more impact-based approach to materiality and time-bound would possibly give a relative prioritization of issues, not an absolute one. It's not that important to say that this is my impact on climate. I mean, there are indicators and you need more impact-based indicators, but to say that I have more impact on climate than I do on biodiversity is valid. That the two are interconnected, climate and biodiversity, is what is lacking in essence, isn't it? When Croda in 2018, that's when I were advising them from the university, started and performed materiality, and we created a strategy together that is people, climate and nature positive, or land positive at the time. So what we did back then is to give the long-term horizon. I mean, the company had a double materiality, and our role was to look ahead, look in the future for all the trends we have, that all of the company, what they wanted to play, and how the sectors change, how these impacts are all interconnected, and to see how, ultimately, a company that wants to be the most sustainable provider of ingredients by 2030, how they can reach that goal. That was the North Star. Okay, that was the impact. With various things. Everything else was tools or vehicles for us to learn, to understand, and to be able to properly invest in the individual parts in order to be able to reach that point. I hope that we can escape from this static materiality that says we have an issue, we report the issue, and we start looking at all these interactions. It's something that rather sooner than later we need to make disappear in its current form, at least from corporate lives. I think we just ran out of time. I will just like to keep 4 or 5 words as a take-home message: impact, purpose, value chain, about this system approach. Feel free to jump in anytime. The role of business in society. Traditionally, companies were comfortable with a narrower role, waiting for someone to give them the viewpoint and how they would do it. We know that the system doesn't change like that. We need coalitions, partnerships, collaboration. Someone needs to make the first step and shout out loud. This is what we call leadership. Thank you so very much for being with us today.